Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. They pulled us from our bunks at 0300 hours with a 4-word command. Full gear, combat ready. No explanation, no mission brief, just that tone in the lieutenant's voice that made you move without asking. We were out of Fort Stewart, part of 3rd Infantry Division, Armor Combat Team Bravo. My tank, Red 1, was a fully loaded M1 SEP version 3 Abrams, the newest in our line and cleaner than it should have been. I'd just gotten it back from depot-level maintenance 2 weeks earlier. My crew was solid, Specialist Renee Hall on the gun, Private Jason Metcalf on the loader, and Corporal Doug Velez driving. Hall had been with me since Kuwait, sharp with targeting and fast under pressure. Metcalf was green, 2 months out of Fort Benning, but followed orders like they were gospel. Velez barely spoke but knew the Abrams like it was a second skin. We were a tight team, and none of us had any idea what was coming. Command gave us almost nothing, just that we were being attached to a rapid civilian stabilization task force under the umbrella of Operation Ironhold. The wording was vague, deliberately so. They loaded the tanks onto flat cars with urgency that didn't match the information they shared. The railheads moved fast, taking us towards Savannah. No one said it aloud, but you could read it in the eyes of every officer we passed. Something was wrong, something big. Usually there's time for idle chatter when you're stuck in transport, but that ride was quiet, just the metal rattle of the cars and the occasional drone of helicopters overhead. Hall leaned against the turret shell and stared at nothing for most of the ride. Velez cleaned his gloves with rubbing alcohol. Metcalf kept checking his sidearm like he didn't trust the holster. When we arrived near the outskirts of the city around 0700, the mood on the ground was already fractured. Trucks with FEMA markings were parked in haphazard lines, some running, some abandoned, with the doors open and maps still flapping on the dash. We passed a Humvee that had a bloody handprint smeared across the inside of the windshield. No bodies, just the print and a cracked radio hanging from the dash by its cord. Medics were moving between triage tents like they'd given up on order, pushing stretchers that looked more like body bags with feet. One of the guard officers told me to report to Sector Charlie, but didn't clarify what was happening, just that we'd be assisting with containment and traffic control near Truman Parkway, supporting a FEMA convoy corridor heading north into South Carolina. He used the phrase containment breach like he was talking about a chemical spill. I asked if this was a riot response. He paused a second too long, then nodded. By the time our tanks rolled off the flatbeds, the city was already changing. We moved in formation, Red 1 through Red 4, down Victory Drive, smoke curling over the rooftops in the distance. Every intersection had abandoned cars, some smashed together like the drivers had just tried to force their way out. Traffic lights were dead. Civilians were on foot, heading in every direction but north. We passed a gas station on fire, with no one even trying to put it out. Hall spotted a body slumped over a shopping cart just outside the storefront, its legs twitching like it was still trying to walk, even though its head looked caved in. Metcalf kept asking if this was part of a drill, not out loud, but just under his breath, like he was hoping someone would say yes. They told us to push through to East Broad Street where the barricades had been overrun. The guard had used school buses, construction barriers, and shipping containers to build a funnel for the evacuees, but it wasn't working. People weren't following the lanes. They weren't even talking anymore, just walking forward, eyes unfocused, ignoring warning shots and pepper spray. We rolled up to find what looked like a wall of human bodies pressed against the fencing, maybe 200 of them. Some were bleeding from the mouth, some dragging legs like they'd already been injured, but they didn't cry out. They didn't shout. They just stared ahead and shoved into the barricades, silently. One of the guard sergeants flagged us down, jumped on my hull, and shouted into the open hatch about a Level 4 biohazard advisory. When I asked what that meant, he said, "No one's cleared to say." Then he pointed to the crowd and told us flat out, if they breached the line, open fire. He didn't say crowd control. He didn't say warning shots. He said open fire. Hall looked at me, waiting. I gave the nod. We started with the cokes, M240 machine gun, short controlled bursts just above their heads. No reaction. I told her to switch to M1028, anti-personnel canister rounds. We fired one into the densest part of the group. Thousands of tungsten balls sprayed forward, turning bodies into a wall of shredded meat and torn fabric. A normal person would run. These didn't even flinch. They climbed over the fallen like they weren't there. Another round, more noise, more impact, and still they advanced. The guard line broke in less than 10 minutes. Someone panicked and tossed a CS grenade too close, caught a group of civilians who weren't infected. One of them ran screaming into the street, only to be tackled and dragged away by two of the others. They weren't feeding, just tearing. Red 2 tried to hold the right flank. Captain UN called over comms, saying they were boxed in behind a jackknifed fuel truck. We tried to reroute, but traffic was frozen. When we lost contact with UN's tank, it wasn't gradual. It was a single shout, a scream, and then just static. Red 4 lost power not long after, overwhelmed near the bus depot when dozens of infected came from beneath a collapsed bridge, crawling through wreckage like ants. We saw the flare go up, a single red bloom against the black smoke, and then nothing. I marked them dark on my HUD and kept moving. We fell back to Liberty Street near the Civic Center, where there was enough open ground to give us sightlines. By then, we'd already been firing high-explosive and multi-purpose anti-tank rounds just to clear obstacles. We weren't aiming at enemies anymore. We were trying to keep the roads passable, which meant blowing apart piles of bodies, burning wrecks, even civilian barricades. It wasn't combat, it was demolition under fire. Command gave us the order to hold Liberty as the last fallback before the highway. We were the final barrier between the breach and the evac convoys. But we weren't a line anymore. We were a single tank with 3 operational crew. Metcalf had started coughing, said he scratched his arm climbing through debris earlier. I checked it myself, just a small tear in the skin, not deep. But I made him keep his gloves on. Velez locked the hatch tight and didn't ask questions. We sat in that intersection for maybe 20 minutes before the next wave came. Not a horde, not a swarm. Just steady, relentless movement from every alley, every storm drain, every half-lit window. Some still wore hospital gowns, others were in business suits, soaked in blood. They moved without coordination, but with one goal: forward. Hall used the cokes to mow down the closest dozen, but more kept stepping over the fallen like nothing had happened. Veles tried to swing the turret, but we were boxed in by wrecked sedans and a flipped armored truck. Every round we fired created more obstacles. Every shell cracked another sidewalk, turned another vehicle into shrapnel. It was like drowning in concrete and flesh at the same time. By the time the sun dropped below the smoke line, the comms had gone from static to silence. I tried every frequency we'd been assigned, even old disaster response bands. Nothing. We weren't part of a battle anymore. We were the last defense before the collapse. No backup, no air support. Just the last Abrams holding a burning city intersection, waiting for the inevitable breach. We hadn't eaten. We hadn't slept. Metcalf started shaking and wouldn't respond when I asked him how he was feeling. Hall took over loading. She didn't argue. Velez told me we had 8 rounds left in the ready rack, maybe another 5 stowed. I started doing the math in my head, not for survival, but for delay. How long could we keep them back? How many minutes could we buy for the next convoy? I couldn't answer, because I knew no more convoys were coming. We stayed in position through dusk, tracking movement in every direction. The infected didn't come all at once. They came in loose clusters, trailing off down side streets, weaving through alleyways, stepping over the dead without hesitation. The city had gone quiet in all the wrong ways. No sirens, no helicopters, no gunfire, just the occasional metallic clatter of something tipping over or the scrape of limbs on asphalt. When the sun finally dipped below the thick grey ceiling of smoke, visibility dropped to near zero. The only light came from the flames still creeping across the rooftops behind us and the glow of the main screen inside the turret. The smoke gave the street a false calm. I knew better. Savannah wasn't holding. It was gone, and our tank was a coffin with an engine. I rotated the turret slowly, scanning the Civic Center parking lot through the thermal scope. I saw bodies, but none were giving off heat, either dead too long or never warm to begin with. One of them had been pinned beneath a fire truck's bumper, Its arm still moved, fingers flexing like it was reaching for something. When Hall noticed, she locked onto it and asked if she should fire. I said no. Not because it wasn't a threat, but because we couldn't afford to waste the round. We had exactly 7 120mm shells left in the rack. Each one meant a last resort, and the clock was already bleeding minutes we couldn't spare. Inside the hull, the air had started to turn. The fans weren't keeping up with the carbon dioxide, and Metcalf's breathing was louder than the hum of the turret electronics. I watched him out of the corner of my eye while pretending to check diagnostics. His face had gone slick with sweat, but not the kind that dries. His skin had taken on a pale, dull color like bad wax. I told myself it was heat, or stress, or the rations sitting too long in the ammo cooler. He insisted he was fine, kept his gloves on, but I didn't like how he held his left arm, tight against his chest, unmoving, like it wasn't really part of him anymore. An hour after sunset, movement on Oglethorpe caught our attention. A bus, alone, turned the corner, tires dragging metal where the rims had collapsed. Its engine sputtered, backfired, and then died completely 20 yards from our position. A man climbed out the back, civilian, maybe mid-30s, shirt soaked red down the front. He was carrying a little girl wrapped in a hospital blanket. She wasn't moving. He staggered toward the tank, screaming for help, but his voice was barely more than a whisper through the filtration system. Hall looked at me for direction. I didn't give any. I just stared through the viewport as he crossed the open ground between wrecked sedans, limping hard on his right side. Before he got 10 paces from the tank, they emerged behind him. Dozens, slow, steady, pulling themselves out of the bus windows, the sewers, the stores across the street. They didn't run. They didn't cry out. They just came, every one of them drawn toward the man like gravity. I opened the hatch and shouted at him to drop the blanket and get clear. He shook his head and kept moving forward. I couldn't hear what he said, just the raw panic on his face. That's when the girl moved. Her hand slipped from the blanket. Her eyes were gone. Hollow. She sank her teeth into his shoulder and didn't let go. He dropped to his knees and screamed until the swarm buried him. Hall chambered a shell and waited for my word. I gave it. She fired an heat round directly into the mass, and the explosion lit the square like daylight for one terrible second. Limbs flew in arcs across the sky, debris clattered against the hull, and a pressure wave slammed into us hard enough to rattle my teeth. When the dust settled, there was nothing left of the man, the girl, or the crowd that took them. Just a scorched patch of earth steaming in the night. Metcalf stopped responding around then. I found him slumped inside the loader's seat, one hand still wrapped around a spare shell. No fever, no bleeding, but his pupils were like pinholes and he wouldn't answer. I shook him hard, twice. He blinked but didn't speak. Velez suggested we secure him and focus on the turret. I nodded and pulled the net restraints across Metcalf's body, tying him down to the side rail with combat rope. If he turned, I wasn't letting him take us with him. At 0130 hours, the ground began to move again. Not an attack. Something different, subtle. I looked through the infrared and saw hundreds of bodies drifting toward the square from all sides. Not charging, just walking. No sounds, no growls, just the sound of countless feet dragging through gravel and shattered glass. Every exit route was blocked within minutes. They didn't even have to plan it. They just moved, and the city moved with them. It was the sheer weight of numbers that made it impossible to break out. We shut off the exterior lights and switched to internal power. The Abrams has enough onboard battery to run critical systems for a few hours, maybe more. But we couldn't use the main engine without drawing attention, so we sat in the dark, every viewport showing more movement, more bodies pressing in. The gun was loaded, the Cokes had one more belt, I had my sidearm. Hall carried a suppressed M4 across her chest and 3 mags. Velez had a 12-gauge with flechette shells he kept stowed behind the drive control panel. It felt pitiful compared to what we'd already spent. Around 0200 hours, a voice came through the comms. Not command, not encrypted, just a broad open band channel repeating over and over. All units, this is Echo 17. Safe zone is compromised. Do not attempt extraction. Repeat, do not attempt extraction. God help us. Then static, and silence again. I looked at Hall and said nothing. She said she wasn't surprised. Then she whispered something else, not to me, but maybe to herself. They never planned on saving us. She was right. The silence inside the hull didn't feel like peace. It felt like pressure, too much of it. Like the city had shifted and was now pressing against the skin of the tank, testing our armor in inches instead of force. It was 0230 when I realized the fans had gone quiet. The low whine of the electronics stopped mid-cycle. No warning light, no alarm, just dead. We were on internal battery power, but even that was failing. The batteries should have lasted longer. Something in the power system had shorted, either heat damage from the earlier impact or just fatigue. Didn't matter. We were drifting dark in a steel box, wrapped in shadows and smoke, with nothing but optics and memory keeping us alive. I moved through the cramped turret, checking each panel by feel, eyes straining against the dull red emergency glow that flickered every few seconds from the status panel. We still had one heat round in the breech, 3 more stowed. Hall sat against the wall, her rifle across her lap, hand resting on the trigger guard like she'd been born with it. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak, just watched. Velez leaned forward, staring through the driver's viewport, saying nothing. The dome light above Metcalf's seat buzzed faintly, casting his face in and out of the dark every few seconds. His skin had gone pale as ash, lips cracked, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. I checked his pulse. It was there but slow, irregular. His arms were tied down tight, and I had my sidearm ready if he so much as twitched the wrong way. We could hear them outside now. Not shouting, not moaning like in the movies, just movement, feet scuffing concrete, bones brushing against the steel, fingers tapping on the hull with no rhythm. Sometimes one of them would slap a hand against the rear plate or scratch along the skirt armor, testing the seams without knowing what they were doing. It was the persistence that made it unbearable, the knowledge that they'd keep going until something gave, until the tank ran out of fuel, air, ammo, or will. By 0300, something changed. The scratching stopped, not all at once, bit by bit, like the crowd had lost interest. I switched to the thermal optics and scanned the surrounding block. They were still there, maybe 200 of them in a loose circle, but they'd stopped moving, just standing, waiting. I counted 3 with military fatigues, 2 wearing EMT jackets, 1 in a bathrobe, barefoot and soaked to the knees. Every single one of them faced our direction, not attacking, not advancing, just watching. We didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing left to say. The only sound was the soft creak of the hull as the Abrams cooled from the inside out. Then Metcalf started humming. It was low, broken, barely more than a vibration. Something slow and off-key, like a melody he'd forgotten halfway through. I turned toward him. His eyes were open, wide, dry, not tracking, no recognition. Just that vacant stare aimed somewhere past the walls of the tank, like he was looking through steel and time at something none of us could see. I asked if he knew where he was. Nothing. No blink, no shift in breathing. Hall leaned toward him cautiously. I stopped her, not with words, just a glance and a slight shake of my head. She froze. The humming kept going. Quiet but constant. Then his body stiffened, slow at first, then violent. His legs locked under the straps, his back arched off the seat as much as the restraints allowed. He let out this wet, rattling noise, like breath caught in something thick and rising. His mouth worked, but no words came, just that sound. Hall grabbed her rifle, but I held up a hand. The acoustics inside a sealed hull amplify everything. One rifle shot in here would have left all of us half-deaf and would have echoed out through every open seam. I grabbed the entrenching tool from the floor stove beside my seat, the folding shovel every crew keeps on board, quiet, heavy. I stepped toward him, carefully, bracing one hand against the turret wall for balance. He was still seizing but weaker now, his movement starting to lag. His eyes never blinked. I raised the shovel, one hard, sharp strike, clean, controlled, no screaming. Just the sound of impact, dull and final, like a closing hatch. Hall turned away, pressed a hand to her mouth, not shaking, not sobbing, just still. Velez didn't flinch. He stayed in the driver's seat, gaze locked on the periscope like he could pretend he hadn't heard anything. But I saw the tension in his shoulders as he reached up and locked the hatch shut again, tight. We were down to 3. By 0400, the tank's internal oxygen was stale and hot. We had to crack the loader's hatch just to keep breathing. Hall and I rotated through watch duty, one monitoring the periphery, the other resting eyes without sleep. I hadn't blinked properly in hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the crowd outside, standing still, facing us, as if they could feel us breathing. I radioed again, this time on an open Coast Guard band. Nothing. I tried civilian emergency frequencies. Still nothing. Then I tried Channel 9 on the trucker CB band. Static. Then a voice. Clear, male, scared, but trying to sound calm. "This is Pete. Peter Lankowski. Anyone receiving? I'm inside a warehouse off Bay Street near the docks. Anyone out there? I can see the smoke. I heard a blast an hour ago. Anyone?" I answered. Told him who we were. Asked how many people were with him. He said just him and his wife. She was hurt. Fever. Probably not going to last the night. He asked if we could come for them. I told him no. Not because I didn't want to, but because we couldn't. There was no way to break through the bodies between us and the docks, not without running dry, not without getting boxed in for good. He didn't beg, just said he understood. Told me he'd leave the warehouse door unlocked in case we changed our mind. Then he said goodbye, and thanked me for talking. That was it. I wrote his name down in my pocketbook without knowing why. By 0500, the sky began to change. Not sunrise, just the black turning grey. Light bleeding through the smoke, like the city was remembering how to breathe. We had 3 shells left, 1 belt of cokes. Hall and I made the call. We couldn't stay. If we waited any longer, we'd die in place. We'd seen what happened to Red 2 and Red 4. I wasn't going out like that. We drew a map by hand on the turret panel, marked what streets looked least choked with wreckage, and pointed the tank south, away from the square, toward Habersham. We were going to push through the infected, get to the last clear zone near the outskirts, maybe find a National Guard depot, maybe just survive long enough to hand off the tank and tell someone what had happened here. I sat back in my command seat, headset crackling with dead air, and gave the word to start the engine. Velez turned the key and hit the throttle. The Abrams roared awake like a sleeping beast under the hull, and the entire city heard it. They turned at once. The roar of the turbine engine shattered the stillness like an explosion. In a city already smothered in smoke and silence, it was a flare in the dark, and every figure in the surrounding blocks responded instantly. The infected didn't charge. They shifted, slowly, purposefully, like animals responding to a tremor in the ground. Hundreds of heads turned toward the sound of our tank. Hundreds of feet began to shuffle forward. They didn't sprint. They didn't howl, but they moved with intent. All eyes on the Abrams, the only living heat signature left on the street. I shouted for Velez to push us forward, right through the lowest concentration at the southern end of Liberty. He gunned the engine, and the tank surged, treads grinding across blood-slick asphalt. The first infected hit the front armor with a soft thud and vanished beneath our weight. Then another, and another. We didn't fire. We couldn't afford it. Hall had her hands near the cokes, but we needed the shells for real barricades, not bone and meat. I could feel the vibrations of the bodies crumpling under the hull like we were rolling over sandbags. We didn't stop. Couldn't. You stop, you get surrounded, and then it's just time. The narrowness of the city streets worked against us. Even with the Abrams' power, maneuverability was limited, and we had to dodge 2 wrecked SUVs blocking the corner of Lincoln Street. Velez veered too sharp, and the right tread clipped a stoplight pole. It scraped down the side armor, shearing metal and throwing sparks. The infected surged from storefronts now, dozens emerging from busted windows and parking garages. Some dropped from second-story balconies without hesitation, their limbs snapping on impact, only to keep crawling towards the tank with their arms dragging behind them. We made it onto Habersham, open enough to build speed. Hall dropped the loader's hatch slightly and braced her rifle against the lip, picking off anything too close to the drive gear. She aimed clean, 1 shot at a time. Center mass didn't matter. Only headshots dropped them for good, but even then, some still twitched. 3 blocks in, we hit our first real obstacle. An old city bus flipped on its side, frame twisted, windows shattered. Around it, a crush of infected lingered like flies on a carcass. They weren't moving toward us yet, just loitering, their heads tilting slightly at the rising noise of the engine. We didn't have the room to skirt around. No alley wide enough for 70 tons of steel to slip through. I gave Hall the go. She chambered an MPAT round, multi-purpose anti-tank, ideal for clearing wreckage and personnel alike. The gun fired with a thunderclap that echoed through the city, the shell slamming into the center of the bus and punching through metal like tissue. The explosion scattered debris in all directions, hurling bodies into the air and ripping a hole just wide enough for us to squeeze through. Velez powered us forward. We bumped over the smoldering wreckage, the whole tank rocking hard enough to lift me an inch from my seat. We didn't look back. Past that, the roads opened slightly. Fewer buildings, more parkland. We pushed toward Victory Drive, trying to make the expressway, but the grid was clogging up again. Dozens of abandoned vehicles, some still with lights flickering weakly, others blackened husks. A delivery truck had crashed into a traffic pole and caught fire, illuminating the infected gathering along both sides of the street. At least 100, maybe more. No room to blast through, not enough shells left to punch a new path. I scanned for any sign of structure we could hold, anything elevated, anything sealed. Then I saw it. Just past the curve, near Daffin Park. A concrete maintenance facility, double-wide doors, narrow access point, and a perimeter fence. Not perfect, but with the tank inside we could bottleneck them, use the Abrams like a wedge, buy time. I pointed it out. Velez turned the hull and pushed us toward the gate. Hall jumped down from the loader's seat, unlocked the emergency gear locker, and tossed me a crowbar. I opened the hatch, leapt down, and sprinted through the thinning morning smoke toward the chain-link entrance. It wasn't locked, just wrapped in wire. I tore at it with shaking hands, breathing through gritted teeth. The street behind me filled with motion, shapes moving fast now, faster than before. They didn't run, not fully, but something about their gait had changed, like they knew this was their chance. I got the gate open, waved the tank forward, and climbed back on top as it passed through. Hall was already pivoting the turret to face the main road, and Velez swung the hull into a diagonal to cover both the front and side. We shut the gate and used the spare chains to rig a temporary barrier. Not strong, but enough to slow anything coming behind. The tank's engine idled, then Velez cut it completely. Silence again. Real silence. No moans, no cries. Just the distant crackle of fire and the wind pushing ash through the trees. I slid back into the commander's seat and looked around. Hall sat with her rifle in her lap, mouth drawn in a tight line. Velez cleaned his glasses on the edge of his undershirt, then put them back on without a word. We had 2 rounds left in the tank. 1 heat, 1 MPAT. The cokes was spent, the crew was down to 3, and one of us hadn't spoken in an hour. I checked the back again. Metcalf's body was still strapped down, still, but the blood was spreading, soaking into the floor grates. The stench was stronger now, clinging to everything, even through the vents. I didn't mention it. We didn't have the bandwidth for fear, only survival. Hall finally broke the silence. "We're not making it to the highway." I didn't answer, because she was right. She adjusted her rifle, checked the chamber, and leaned back against the turret shell. "If we stay here, maybe the signal picks up. Maybe someone's still out there." She was grasping, but it was all we had. The city was dead. The army wasn't coming back. The last message from Echo 17 had made that clear. But sometimes hope isn't about believing. It's about refusing to let go, even when logic says you should. I powered down the last non-essential systems and pulled out the laminated logbook from beneath the console. I started writing. Every detail I could remember: when the barricades fell, what frequency channels had gone dark, the names of the dead crews, our ammunition count, the location of the last convoy we saw. It wouldn't change anything. But if someone found the tank later, they'd know we didn't go down blind. I signed it with my name: Staff Sergeant Mason Trent, 3rd Armored Combat Team, United States Army, Red 1. The sun had just started to rise. I looked out across the street, through the gate. Dozens of them were gathering again, walking toward us, drawn by the sound of a memory. Not fast, but they never needed to be. By 0600 hours, the sun had climbed just high enough to push through the worst of the smoke, casting long, fractured shadows across the maintenance yard. It felt like the world had stopped moving, like the city was holding its breath. From the top hatch, I could see them lining up again, Rows of the infected, silent and slow, drifting toward the gate in uneven clusters. Their movements didn't follow logic or momentum, they just followed pressure, gravitational, psychological, whatever you want to call it, and we were the center of it now. We couldn't run. The tank couldn't punch through another full street of wreckage without fuel and shells. We couldn't hide. Not in a 70-ton steel behemoth with black soot stains across the glacis plate and a gutted crew compartment. So we prepared to hold. Hall spent the next half hour reinforcing the gate. She found a broken trailer axle in the yard and jammed it through the chain link weave, then wrapped it with steel cable from an old generator. She set trip lines with chem lights and empty MRE cans. It wouldn't stop them, but it might buy us warning. Velez moved ammo from the stowage bins to the turret floor, 2 rounds neatly stacked beside his feet, ready to load. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His hands moved with that quiet rhythm of someone who understood exactly what came next. I stayed on the gunner's scope, scanning, watching, counting. They approached in slow waves, like water swelling against a seawall, a few at a time, then more. Some stumbled into each other. Others walked with surgical aim, heads cocked at angles too sharp for any living vertebrae. A man in a marine dress uniform, a woman with a missing lower jaw, a boy no older than 10, barefoot and dragging a backpack that left a crimson trail behind him. None of them flinched. None of them hesitated. I thought about Metcalf, his humming, the way his eyes lost recognition before his body gave out. I thought about Red 2's final broadcast, about Captain Yuen's last words, "Tell them we held the line." I wasn't sure what holding the line meant anymore, not when there was no line left, only memory, only instinct. At 07:15, they reached the perimeter. The first hands gripped the chain link, then the others followed. No urgency, no screams, just that awful persistence, the sound of flesh dragging steel, bone-knocking metal. Hall had set a makeshift claymore, an old hydraulic battery hooked to a pressure trip, just inside the gate. It triggered exactly once. A shockwave burst outward, slamming 5 or 6 of them backwards, tearing skin and clothing in jagged sheets. The rest stepped over the bodies like broken pavement. I gave the order. Velez chambered the heat round. Hall took the gunner's station. She fired. The shell hit dead center, ripping through the crowd, shattering bone and concrete. The shock knocked several more back from the gate, but others surged forward immediately. A few caught fire from the secondary ignition, but they didn't seem to notice. One of them, half his face missing, walked through open flame like it was rain. Another climbed over a pile of bodies, arms missing at the elbow, and kept moving with his teeth bared and nothing else to use. I stood in the commander's seat, rifle in hand, and fired controlled bursts toward the advancing line. Head, neck, miss, hit, drop. I worked the rhythm like I was back on the range, except this wasn't practice. This was the last radio station in a world that had gone quiet. The infected didn't care. For everyone that dropped, 3 more climbed the fence or pushed through the broken gate. I gave Velez the signal. He loaded the last MPAT round, rotated the turret, and fired straight into the center of the yard. The blast was deafening. Dust and flame bloomed outward, throwing infected backward and igniting the underbrush near the fence. The tank rocked so hard on its suspension that the commander's seat cracked along the armrest. I dropped back inside, coughing through smoke and scorched rubber. But the breach didn't stop. They kept coming. Velez was hit first. One of them had climbed the flank while we were focused forward. It dropped through the hatch like a spider, teeth latching onto his shoulder before we could turn. He didn't scream, just reached for his sidearm and fired straight through the thing's skull. It dropped, twitching. Velez followed it down, still breathing, but barely. Hall dragged him clear, shoved gauze into the wound, and pressed down with both hands. His eyes fluttered. He muttered something in Spanish I couldn't understand. Then he stopped. Hall didn't move, just stared at him, hands still pressing down. Her face had the same expression I'd seen in the mirror the day my first crew burned in a fuel fire overseas, hollow, numb, somewhere past emotion. She didn't argue when I said we had to go. We climbed out the top hatch together, weapons drawn, moving across the yard toward the far fence. I led, Hall covering. The infected flooded into the maintenance lot behind us, climbing onto the tank, clawing at the turret, pounding on the armor like they could smell what was inside. I paused once, looked back. Red One. My tank. Our tank. Still standing, covered in soot, smeared with blood, final witness to what Savannah became. Then we ran. I don't remember how far. Half a mile? Maybe more. Through burned-out intersections and shattered homes. We found a drainage canal near the edge of the freeway and dropped inside, crawling through sludge and mud and broken glass until the sun was well overhead. No one followed, not yet. Eventually we reached a culvert, half collapsed, filled with trash and old shopping carts. Hall sat down and didn't speak. I sat beside her, listened for anything. Nothing came. It's been hours since then, maybe longer. I'm writing this in the back pages of my operations logbook, using the stub of a pencil I found in my vest. The tank is still in the yard off Victory Drive. Red One. My name is Staff Sergeant Mason Trent, United States Army. I don't know what city still stands. I don't know if I'll last the next night. But I know we didn't fold. We didn't run when it mattered. We held the line. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.